They laughed as if life itself was playing one final cruel joke. A weary mother, standing beside her children, received nothing but a rusted, broken-down van as her share of the family inheritance. To her in-laws, it was a punchline, a symbol of how little she mattered. But what they didn't know was that beneath the peeling paint and corroded metal, this van held a secret that would not only change her family's future, but reveal the unshakable worth of a woman the world had dismissed too soon. My beautiful family and friends, welcome back. If you're ready for another unforgettable story, do me a quick favor, hit that like button. Why? Because each like tells YouTube, this story is worth sharing with more people who might really need it today. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I do read every single one, and it makes me feel like we're sitting together in the same room, sharing these moments heart to heart. And don't forget to share this video with someone you love. You never know, the story you share might be the encouragement they've been praying for. This isn't just a channel, it's a family. And when you engage, you're helping us build a safe space where real stories bring real hope. Amina woke before dawn like she always did. The house breathed in that thin, fragile hour between night and the waking world. The kitchen light flickered when she turned it on. The old bulb hummed like a tired insect. She moved quietly so the children could keep sleeping a little longer. Zara, 12, curled under a rumpled blanket with a braid fallen across her forehead. Nico, 9, slept with a pencil tucked behind one ear as if his dreams were half homework. Little Aim, 4, had buried his face into the stuffed rabbit he'd named Mr. Moon and breathed in the cotton smell of comfort. Amina smoothed the blanket from Zara's shoulder and whispered, "I'll be back before school, love." She kissed each small forehead like it was the last currency she owned. Outside, rain had left dark patches on the cracked pavement. The bus that usually took Amina to the cafe where she worked on early shifts was late again. She walked the 15 minutes anyway, dragging a tote heavy with the children's uniforms and the single shirt she could steam at the laundromat on Saturdays. On the way, she stopped at Mrs. Lowe's stoop and carried the grocery bag inside without a complaint, because she always did. Mrs. Lowe had arthritis and tales that ran like rivers. She paid Amina with warm tea and a story about a youth she never had. Little acts. Small kindnesses. They were the stitching that kept Amina awake at night, the thin thread she clung to whenever the bills crowded the table like unpaid guests. At the cafe, Amina wiped counters until they shone the way shame sometimes had to. She topped up coffee pots, steadied the half-closed pastry case, and moved her hands with the slow certainty of someone who has learned how to survive by rhythm. Customers came and went with the economy's indifferent hum. Two businessmen arguing about a contract, a student burying her face in a laptop, elderly men who ordered the usual and sipped like that small predictable pleasure could be insurance against time. From the back of the kitchen, Amina watched them all and remembered her husband's laugh, a sound she still expected to hear when she opened the back door. His absence was an ache shaped like a name. He died 2 years ago, sudden and ordinary and forever. The diagnosis had been a sentence slipped into an envelope. He'd left no fortune, only a mortgage and a workshop of tools clenched in a room under the garage that Amina had no idea how to sell. Her in-laws, the family she had married into, had never hidden how little they thought of her. They called her practical, sometimes cheap, as if frugality was a moral failing rather than a survival skill. They lived 2 streets over in a larger house with a manicured lawn, a 3rd-story balcony, and a hedge that kept their life private. Every Sunday they hosted lunches with platters and laughter that felt like a currency Amina could never earn. When Ada and Samuel, the siblings of her late husband, learned he died, they showed the kind of sorrow practiced in magazines. Formal, measured, delivered with a hand on the shoulder that kept distance. Amina noticed how their eyes skimmed her clothes in a way that catalogued lack. "Your sister-in-law works 3 jobs." Mrs. Samuel said once at a family gathering, the question folded in a way that was not curiosity but incredulity. "How does she manage?" The room tittered. Their laughs were not sharp. They were like the sound of coins clinking into a cash register where Amina would never be paid. She kept her head down and kept going. She could not afford anger. Anger had teeth that would bite up the little she did have. Amina's currency was steadiness, getting Zara to school on time, making sure Nico finished his math workbook, making Aim's hair into tiny puffs every morning so he would feel small and beautiful. On bad weeks, she missed a bill or two and paid late fees that shredded the already thin margin of her sanity. On good weeks she found a forgotten 10 in a pocket or a neighbor paid her back for a favor, and the relief tasted like weather breaking. There were small joys, too. Nico had a crooked tooth that made his grin look determined. Zara wrote stories with characters who never quit. Aim could memorize the shape of clouds better than anyone Amina had ever met. They were lightning bolts of hope. They were reasons to stay. Life's economy, however, has an odd way of balancing scales. 2 months after the funeral, a letter arrived stamped from the solicitor's office with a heading that felt like an all-caps verdict. A reading of the will was scheduled one gray Thursday afternoon. A polite note tucked between routine bills, an invitation to witness the last distribution of a man's things. Amina folded the letter into her purse until it was soft and thin and went on with the schedule she had: work, school runs, checking the slow drip of emails like someone hoping for rain. The day of the reading, Amina stood at the back of the living room in her Sunday dress, not new, but ironed crisp. The house smelled of baked goodies and the kind of expensive perfume that clings to the air like a reminder. Ada and Samuel stood beneath a framed family portrait, the faces polished like coins. They had arranged chairs and plates to make the event look ceremonious. A solicitor read, "To my siblings Ada and Samuel, I leave the family house and all furniture. To my wife's sister-in-law, Amina, I leave the van." Silence spilled like a trickle. A murmur. Ada's lips pressed into a line. Samuel's chin lifted, small victory in posture. Amina felt her throat tighten as if someone had pushed a hand through it. She tried to imagine a van, a practical, useful thing that could ferry the children to school, move boxes in an emergency, a resource. It would be enough, she thought. It would be a beginning. After the reading, the family moved like moths toward a silver tea tray. Jokes were made with the ease of practiced cruelty. The van. Ada said loud enough for everyone to hear, the sound like a small bell. "Isn't that the rusted thing Grandpa used to tinker with in the yard? I remember it, nasty smell inside, seats that leak." Her laugh made the front of everyone's face ripple politely. When Amina finally stood in the driveway to look at the van, she understood what they'd meant. The vehicle was worse than rusted. It was a hulk of peeling paint and exposed metal. Its headlights were cloudy. A layer of moss had taken hold in the wheel wells like a quiet waiting thing. The windows rattled when the wind touched them. Somewhere behind that decay was a history of long trips, of a man who kept tools in the back and screws in jars. A thin ribbon of oil stained the driveway beneath like a small permanent bruise. Samuel let out a laugh that had a sharpened edge. "Leaving this to them," he said loudly so the neighbors would hear. He gestured with 2 fingers like a director. "Give them the van and their little lives will be on the road to nowhere." Ada's guests clapped, the sound brief and brittle. Someone called it charity. Someone else called it a joke. Amina knelt and ran a finger along the door seam. The paint flaked like old news. She could have let humiliation hollow her out, could have retreated inside and counted the ways it would be impossible. Repairs, plates, registration, the mechanic's estimate that would be a number she didn't have. But her hand found the door handle, and she imagined the children inside, 3 small bodies watching her drive away with a possibility that was as thin as tissue and as real as breath. She could fix a van, she decided. Not today. Not tomorrow, perhaps. But she could learn. She had learned how to mend broken things long before marriage, how to coax a lost child to sleep, how to sew a hem with fingers that had calluses like honors. On the way home, neighbors watched as she steered the van down the lane, its engine coughing like a throat with a cold. Nico peered out the back window, wide-eyed, as if he had been handed a secret. Zara held Aim's hand so tightly their knuckles were white. Amina felt the weight of the world in her palm, not heavy so much as dense with possibility. The laughter from the in-laws echoed behind them like a road sign announcing what they believed the world thought of them: disposable, comic, lesser. When they stopped at a red light, a woman in a business suit glanced over and nodded in sympathy as if pity could be fashionable. Amina adjusted the mirror and straightened her spine. They could laugh. She had made a plan already in the quiet that sits between breaths. She would clean the seats, replace the bulbs, learn the rhythm of the engine. She would keep the kids safe. She had no idea the van carried secrets deeper than rust, nor did she know that the world had a way of returning kindness to its source in the most unlikely of packages. For now she had a choice: to let shame be a door that closed forever, or to use the van like a key. When someone overlooks or dismisses you, how do you keep moving forward? What small, everyday acts of resilience do you carry that others might mistake for weakness? The van sat in the driveway like an insult too big to move. For 3 days, Amina wiped down its panels with an old rag dipped in soapy water. She pried open doors that screeched as though they resented her persistence. The neighbors watched, curious, shaking their heads when they thought she couldn't see. Zara and Nico helped where they could. Zara emptied out old cans, stray bolts, and a heap of newspapers yellowed with time. Nico attacked the moss with a plastic brush, humming to himself. Little Aim sat cross-legged on the curb, his stuffed rabbit perched beside him like an apprentice. To everyone else, it looked like desperation, a widow clinging to something worthless. To Amina, it was an act of defiance. "We will make this ours," she whispered to the children. "If the world gives us scraps, we will stitch a feast." It was on the 4th day that she noticed an elderly man standing at the gate. His suit was neat, but his shoes told another story: scuffed, soles thinning. His face was worn with a kind of exhaustion that didn't come from labor but from life. "Excuse me," he said softly, almost embarrassed. "I don't mean to intrude. I saw you cleaning. This van, did it once belong to a man named Daniel?" Amina stiffened. Daniel. Her husband. "Yes," she said cautiously. "It was my husband's. Do you know him?" The man's eyes flickered with something she couldn't place: sorrow, recognition, perhaps even guilt. "We worked together a long time ago," he said. "He helped me once. I was a young man in trouble. He didn't have to, but he gave me food, a place to sleep for a night, and the money to get home." His voice cracked slightly. "I never forgot." Amina's throat tightened. Daniel had been that way, offering kindness like it was breath, never keeping tally. "I'm sorry," she said. "He passed away 2 years ago." The man lowered his head. Silence stretched. Then, almost apologetically, he asked, "Would you allow me to help you with the van? I know a thing or two about engines." And he hesitated. I don't have much, but I'd like to repay a kindness I never got to before. She could have refused. Pride and exhaustion often wrestled in her, and sometimes pride won. But something about the man's humility touched her. She nodded. Thank you. That would mean a lot. That evening, while the children sat on the curb eating bread with jam, the man, who introduced himself as Mr. Ellis, rolled up his sleeves and inspected the engine. His hands trembled at first, but once inside the machinery, they steadied with memory. This isn't as bad as it looks, he murmured. Underneath the rust, this is solid. Built strong. Built to last. Amina leaned against the fence, arms crossed, watching him. She wasn't used to people offering help without strings. It unsettled her, softened her in ways that frightened her. Over the next week, Mr. Ellis kept coming back. Together, they replaced the spark plugs, scrubbed grime, patched the seats. Nico followed him like a shadow, peppering him with questions. Why does it smoke when you start it? What's that piece do? Zara kept notes, sketching parts as though documenting a science experiment. Even Aim offered help, handing tools too big for his tiny hands. The neighbors whispered. Some said Amina had found a new man. Others said she was wasting her time on scrap metal. The in-laws drove by once, Ada lowering her window just enough to sneer. Still polishing that coffin, Amina, she called. Laughter followed like exhaust. Amina said nothing. She simply picked up her rag and kept working. The act of kindness wasn't just Ellis offering help. It was the way Amina treated him in return. She brought him tea every evening in the chipped mug Daniel once used. She packed him bread and soup when he left, insisting he not go hungry. When she saw the state of his shoes, she quietly gave him Daniel's old pair, polished and cleaned. He protested, but she pressed them into his hands with a smile. Please. He would have wanted this. Ellis looked at her, then with something close to awe. You're just like him, he said softly. One night, after the children were asleep, Ellis lingered by the gate. His voice was hesitant, carrying the weight of something unspoken. You don't know what this means to me, he said. Most people walk past me now like I don't exist. You didn't. That matters. Amina felt a strange ache bloom in her chest. She thought of how often people overlooked her, the widow, the struggling mother, the woman with nothing but a rusted van. And yet here was someone who saw her, who was grateful for her presence in the smallest ways. By the end of the second week, the van coughed less when it started. Its headlights shone brighter. The children began to dream aloud about where they might go in it. We could drive to the lake, Nico said, or camp in the woods. Zara suggested writing stories in the back seat. Aim declared they could chase clouds until the sky runs out. Amina listened, smiling. For the first time in years, hope felt like something she could hold. She still couldn't know, that this small act of kindness, of accepting help and giving it back, was the beginning of something extraordinary. Have you ever helped someone, only to realize their kindness to you mattered even more than what you gave? What if the smallest act of compassion, even polishing a rusted van, was the spark that changed everything? For a while, life regained its modest rhythm, like a song played on repeat that somehow still felt new. Mornings blurred into the same careful choreography, Zara's stories folded into lunches, Nico's crooked tooth sparking sideways smiles at breakfast, little Aim asking the same question about clouds until Amina answered it with a new story each time. The van, scuffed, dented, but now with a quieter engine, sat in the driveway like a reluctant promise. Amina found herself humming when she worked, a thin thread of optimism that kept the cold from seeping in. Work at the cafe tightened into a familiar grind. The owner, Mrs. Patel, paid an exact change in praise, and Amina liked the predictability of it. She was given the early morning shift and the closing shift on alternate days so she could pick the kids up. The hours were long, the tips small, but the customers were human and, for the most part, patient. When the neighborhood's power flickered one Thursday and the espresso machine coughed to life again, Amina offered every stranded customer an extra cookie on the house, the little act of generosity fitting in the pockets of her day like a secret coin. There were surprises that were not kindly. A parking ticket on the windshield, invalidated when she argued, but not before she had to stand in line and lose time she could not afford. A leaky pipe under their sink that required a new part. A school notice asking for $30 for an excursion that would mean the world to Zara. Each little demand pressed at her like a fist on a closed book. She made budgets on the backs of envelopes and called the electric company with a voice that negotiated patience for a while. Some nights she lay awake and rehearsed what ifs the way some people recite prayers. What if the van refuses to start when AIM has a fever? What if the mechanic asks for more than she can give? Yet, even under those small pressures, Amina's kindness remained steady. When a teenager stumbled into the cafe one evening, hair wet and shoes soaked from rain, she slipped off her own shawl and wrapped it around him without thinking. When Mrs. Lowe forgot her purse and came running back near tears, Amina paid for the milk with coins she had set aside for an emergency. She did these things because it had become a part of her, because empathy had been taught to her as much by Daniel's example as by necessity. She treated others as if no stranger might ever be their last hope. The van became a classroom of its own. On weekends, Amina taught herself more: how to check the oil, how to top up the coolant, how to tell when a belt had been worn thin. She learned by thumbing through online forums with the cafe's crack tablet during slow hours and watching Mr. Ellis show her hands-on tricks in the driveway. The children helped too. Zara read manuals aloud like they were stories. Nico learned to hand tools and count bolts. Aim's small fingers were tasked with sweeping the floorboards until they gleamed. Pride pooled in Amina's chest at the sight of them. No one would say they were helpless if she could help it. But life kept testing the seams. One rainy afternoon, with the days taking smaller than usual, Mrs. Patel announced a sudden audit of the cafe's expenses. "We might have to cut shifts," she said from behind the counter, voice clipped and apologetic. The room held its breath. Amina felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. If shifts were cut, her already thin ledger would tremble: electric bill, school supplies, the small debt carried from the funeral's last expenses. She swallowed and promised herself she wouldn't panic out loud. She would take extra hours wherever she could find them. Still, even as the world pressed, her hands reached for kindness. On the day of the audit, she covered a late lunch for a man who had lost his job and had spilled coffee on his only suit. He returned the next day asking how to repay her. She shrugged and suggested he return when he could. "You saved me more than my shirt," he said. "You gave me time to breathe." That was how the small accounts of human exchange continued to accumulate, not in cash, but in credit lines of dignity. Meanwhile, the quiet observer of their lives did not vanish. Mr. Ellis became a steady presence, at first with tools and advice, later with a little more elbow room in his laugh and a kindness that had room to grow. He visited the cafe sometimes, sat at the corner table, and watched Amina teach the children how to identify a bad spark plug. He asked about Daniel with a respect that felt like an ache rather than curiosity. Amina answered with short stories about the man who could fix a radiator with nothing but hope and optimism. Over time, Mr. Ellis began to speak to others in small ways that suggested his interest extended beyond mere repair work. He lingered on the phone in low voices with an old friend who ran the scrapyard 2 streets over, Jonah, a man whose hands knew the language of metal. Once, when Amina and the children were at the library, she saw Mr. Ellis hand a scrap of paper to Jonah through the gate. Jonah's eyebrows rose, and he pocketed the note like a secret. Amina shrugged it off. She had learned not to read too much into other people's speech. Yet small unease lodged in the back of her mind like a pebble in a shoe. Jonah took a look at the van one morning when Mr. Ellis asked a favor. He was a blunt man with a laugh that could split wood and a way of saying what he thought without polish. He crawled under the van, the metal biting into his palms, and frowned. "This thing's heavier than it should be," he muttered, more to himself than the others. He ran a hand along the floorboard and tapped. The sound was duller than expected, a note that did not quite match the vehicle's age. He pulled out a small magnet from his pocket and pressed it against the undercarriage in a casual motion, more to test than to announce anything. The magnet didn't cling. Jonah lifted his eyebrows in a way that suggested a missing puzzle piece. "It's not sticking," he said aloud. "Most of the body's steel. It should stick." He shrugged, then laughed and told Amina she'd been given a stubborn relic that refused to give in to rust. Amina watched Jonah and felt nothing but gratitude to the man who had helped clean the wheel wells free of moss. She didn't know that Jonah's comment, tossed off like a line of small weather, would be a seed that would grow in someone else's mind. She didn't know either that when Mr. Ellis spoke the following week with a woman who sometimes sat in the cafe and ordered black coffee, a woman whose bracelets were subtle and whose eyes were the color of a bank vault, he used words that sounded like more than the casual passing of information. He said, "There's something about the van. It's heavier than it looks. Maybe it's worth a proper look." The woman, who introduced herself as Lenora in passing, smiled with no teeth showing. She nodded like someone cataloging inventory. She left behind a business card the size of a coin that Amina did not notice. The card, when Mr. Ellis later retrieved it from his wallet, simply had a single line, "L. Harrow Collections." As the weeks folded into months, Amina's life continued its steady, if precarious motion. She patched leaks, watched the kids' homework, learned the van's quirks. She remained unaware that other eyes had begun to map the curve of her life like a road atlas, that hands she'd never held were considering the weight of something she thought was scrap. She still thought the laughter from her in-laws was the loudest of the world's opinions. She did not imagine that the van had already begun to change the way strangers moved around her like a constellation forming without her knowledge. On a quiet evening, after the cafe had emptied and a streetlight hummed to life down the block, Amina sat at the kitchen table and counted the month's bills again. Zara slept with a notebook at her bedside. Nico read a comic by the lamp. Aim's stuffed rabbit lay on the floor like a sentinel. She rubbed the bridge of her nose and called her sister on the line. They spoke for 15 minutes about nothing in particular, about a recipe, about the weather, and the ordinary smallness of that call warmed her. She had no hint that the van's secret hummed a different tune beneath her feet, or that people with soft shoes and sharp eyes were already plotting how to answer the question of what the rusted hulk might be hiding. When you keep going despite repeated setbacks, who notices? Have you ever felt like your quiet, daily resilience was invisible, and if someone did finally see it, what would you want them to know about the person you are? Word had a way of folding itself into unexpected shapes in a small neighborhood. What had begun as curious glances and muttered bets in doorways matured into careful observation. Lenora, the woman with the bank vault eyes and the plain business card, didn't shout her interest. She moved like someone who catalogued value as a muscle memory, stepping softly and watching how people treated the things and the lives around them. Mr. Ellis, grateful and oddly protective, answered to an impulse he could not name. He began to nudge situations into being. If kindness was currency, he wanted to invest it where it had once been spent. The first test came as a small public thing. The local community center announced a weekend market to raise funds for the library's children's program. Vendors signed up to sell pies, second-hand clothes, and handcrafted soaps. The market was the sort of communal ritual that invited neighborliness and the occasional petty disagreement. Lenora, apparently, was on the organizing committee. An unremarkable fact, she volunteered in the meeting room one evening while she scribbled notes on a legal pad. She watched Amina from the back, as if cataloging posture. "Would you consider running a stall?" she asked later, slipping into conversation like weather. "You could sell baked goods or," her voice suggested possibilities and left them like seeds. Amina hesitated. Between cafe shifts and kid schedules, it felt like squeezing a penny until it squealed. But the thought of seeing Zara and Nico charting a table, of Aim peeking from behind jars of jam, warmed something in her chest. She agreed, and in doing so she agreed to a small public demonstration of what she could do when the neighborhood watched. The market day arrived with a sky the color of cheap paper. Wind bumped against the tarpaulin of stalls and scattered napkins like small white birds. Amina's table was modest. Mason jars of lemon curd, a tin of scones wrapped in waxed paper, and a stack of Zara's little handwritten bookmarks that read, "Read loud. Dream louder." People bought, chatted, and moved on. At one point, a man spilled change across her table, coins glinting and rolling like small moons. He cursed softly and started to collect them with a fluster that read as embarrassed and hurried. Amina did what came naturally. She knelt and helped him, smiled, and handed the coins back. No one had to watch to make her do it. Lenora noticed. She noticed the way Amina's hands moved, the steadiness when she bent to tie a child's shoelace, the absent-minded way she smoothed flour into a palm and then brushed it off as if it were nothing. The observation felt like an increasing tally in Lenora's mind. The second test was quieter and choreographed with more intent. Jonah, the scrapyard man with a blunt laugh, received a call from someone who wanted to buy the van outright. "Come and look," the caller said, a voice smoothed by money. Jonah asked Mr. Ellis if Amina would mind him offering a price. He said it casually, as if it were a neighborly favor. "We'll pay for repairs," Jonah told Amina when he came by, wiping his hands on a rag. "We can get you some cash, help you out. You can go on with your life." He played it like charity. Amina listened, fingers wrapped around a cup of tea that had cooled. The offer could have been salvation. The bills wiped clean, the pressure softened. She pictured a number, a bright line on a page that would rearrange the arithmetic of her life. But when she thought of the van, the image that rose in her chest wasn't about money. It was Daniel's hands on the wheel, the jar of screws that found its place beneath the passenger seat, the times the van had been a shelter when a storm surprised them. It was, in its own stubborn way, part memory. "No," she said simply. Jonah blinked. "I can't sell. Not now." He shrugged and left, shaking his head like a man with a mystery he couldn't solve. Lenora watched from across the street, unseen, and made a quiet note in the margins of her pad. The tests became more pointed. A young man with a bright jacket and a smile too practiced to be sincere came to the cafe one morning. He introduced himself as Max and offered Amina a gift, a small project managing a fleet of delivery drivers for a local business, work that promised decent pay and shifts that fit between school runs. He wanted her to join immediately and asked if she would drive one of the company's vans for a trial. There was no pressure, he said, only an opportunity. He left a card. On its face, the job sounded good. On its face, it was a chance, perhaps even a seed of something bigger. Yet Mr. Ellis, standing near the counter with an old newspaper, watched Amina with a slightly pinched face. He later told her, simply, "He's not all he seems. He asks for trust too quickly." She didn't ask for details. She declined gently, citing the instability of her schedule and school pickups, but something in her voice asked for time. Lenora's eyes, when they met Amina's across the room that day, suggested calculation rather than judgment. Not all tests were about money or opportunity. Some were moral. A younger woman left a wallet on the cafe counter, full of cash and a phone that buzzed with important calls. Amina could have slipped the notes into her apron and walked a few extra steps with some dignity purchased by desperation. Instead, she rang the visible number and asked, "Is this yours?" When the woman returned, breathless, she hugged Amina with a kind of relief that rearranged her shoulders. The man's wallet had contained enough to tide someone over for a month. Those moments of truth, when no one watched but the world still noticed, were the notes Lenora recorded, the quiet evidence that would later read like testimony. Lenora took more direct action when she commissioned what she called an appraisal. She sent a young technician to the neighborhood under the pretense of cataloging old vehicles in the area for a community exhibition on industrial design. The technician, a small, earnest man named Reese, asked to take pictures of the van and run a few quick tests. Mr. Ellis was there, polite and nervous. Jonah hovered as if to protect the vehicle's dignity. Reese pressed a small device against the metal and frowned. Then he did something small and strange. He used a magnet, and it too refused to cling. "It's odd," he said into his clipboard. "You'd expect it to be standard steel." He tapped the fender and the sound was wrong again, dull and dense. He excused himself and said he would send the notes to his supervisor. This time the whispering didn't stay local. It traveled to Lenora's office like light through a window. She called Mr. Ellis and asked him to be patient. She told Jonah to keep quiet. She visited the cafe under the quieter pretense of paying for coffee and leaving a tip that was too generous for the establishment, a small dissonant gesture that made the staff glance. Each move was a soft probe, a gentle pressure that tested how Amina would bend. What Lenora was testing for wasn't whether Amina would accept money or opportunity. She was testing a temperament. Did Amina keep the human being at the center of temptation? Would she barter warmth for comfort, or would she allow her dignity to remain intact even when the ledger balanced against her? She watched the way the mother kept her hands clean of things she'd not earned and judged the measure of a person by small habitual refusals. As the tests accumulated, Mr. Ellis felt a tension coil under his gratitude. He had initially nudged these moments out of devotion to a memory of Daniel. Now he did it to protect Amina from the sharper edges of attention. Once, when Lenora proposed sending a researcher to talk to Zara about the kids' stories and possibly include them in a local anthology, he bristled. "Don't take advantage," he told Lenora in a voice that trembled like an old cord. Lenora only smiled in a way that suggested she had not yet decided if she was the giver or the receiver in this arrangement. Her hands, with a faint hint of a manicure that never quite matched the rest of her plainness, folded the paper in her lap. Her presence was quiet, but the waves she sent across the neighborhood were precise. The observation became an experiment, the experiment, a search for character. Amina, living in the middle of the testing like someone who had accidentally walked into a room full of mirrors, kept doing what she always did. She mended, she answered. She worked late to make up for unexpected school fees. She refused offers that would have meant losing something intangible. She returned kindness for kindness whether the world saw it or not. Her decisions were not dramatic. They were made at the level of habit. That steady fidelity, to memory, to children, to the small rules she gave her life, accumulated into a quiet argument for who she was. As the final days of this act passed, Lenora leaned back and studied the small catalog she'd made. The times Amina refused, the ways she refused, the moments she reached out without hoping to be paid. She began to feel a pull she hadn't expected, not merely curiosity about a van that didn't behave like a van, but a growing respect for the person who treated other people the way she did, kindly, without calculation. When someone watches you closely, what do your small decisions reveal? Are your acts of kindness private by habit or by design? And if someone tested you, what would they find at your core? On a winter afternoon when the sky looked like the inside of an old book, the neighborhood felt thinner somehow, spaces between houses more obvious, the distance between people a little sharper. Amina sat at her kitchen table with a stack of photographs spread before her, each one a small universe. She'd taken them out because Zara had begged for stories about before. The children had an appetite for memory the way they had an appetite for bread. They asked questions that pressed the edges of what she could hold. "You never told us about the day you and Daddy moved into our first flat," Zara said, leaning forward with the focus of a small scholar. Amina laughed, a warm sound that carried both ache and something like gratitude. "We arrived with 2 suitcases and a neighbor who gave us soup because he said newness deserved warmth." She traced a finger along a photo where Daniel's arm was around her shoulder, the two of them skinny with hope. "Daniel liked to fix things," she said. "Not because he had to. Because he loved seeing how something came back to life." In the soft light, she began to tell them, not for the first time, but as if each telling welded the past into a stronger shape. She spoke of her mother, Alia, who had washed dishes at a boarding school and learned to hum while her hands moved. Alia had taught Amina that kindness was a muscle. "It's how you keep from breaking," Alia used to say, pressing her knuckles into the dough until it softened. "You give what you can. And when you cannot give, you listen. Nobody is made of nothing." That was Amina's earliest curriculum: bread, listening, and the quiet mathematics of mercy. The stories traced a map of small refusals and brave acceptances. When Amina was a teenager, she'd given up a scholarship to stay home and care for her younger brother when their mother fell ill. She learned to manage money in penny folds, to find joy in secondhand books, to make birthdays feel like summers even when the refrigerator hummed a song of not enough. Daniel's laughter had been her reward. His tools, his patient explanations about engines, were his love language. He had been the kind of man who fixed torn hems and also fixed broken hearts with a pot of stew and a stubborn notion that everything deserved repair. These memories didn't gild the present so much as give it texture. Amina's compassion was not the product of sentimentality. It was a worn and reliable habit that had kept their family upright during storms. It was also why she could not sell the van, not because it was precious in itself, but because it was a vessel of moments, the Sunday trips to the river, the time they'd slept in its back when an unexpected storm had washed the roads away, the boxes of clothes Daniel had promised to mend. To her, the van was a ledger of ordinary love. Across town, other memories moved in parallel, though they belonged to someone who had once worn a different kind of life. Lenora Harrow's childhood had been filed away in tidy compartments: boarding schools, summer houses, and a mother who taught her the exact weight of silence. Lenora had been raised among objects that carried pedigree, silver that kept perfect lines, cabinets filled with porcelains catalogued like little empires. She learned early to see value where others missed the shape of it. Her family's business, Harrow and Company, had been in collections and acquisitions for 3 generations: antiquities, industrial relics with stories, and sometimes, people's small legacies bought or protected with that particular kind of discretion that money breeds. But Lenora's story had an unexpected soft place. Her father, a stern man whose smiles were rare and therefore priceless, had once taken her to a scrapyard at the age of 12. There, amid the rust and forgotten parts, he had shown her how to listen to metal, how different metals sang different notes under a tap, how some things were heavier than they looked because of what hid beneath the surface. Never judge by skin, he said, and Lenora had watched a magnet fail to cling to a piece and felt the thrill of discovery like a hand on her back. That childish thrill became a skill, which became a job, which became quiet power. Lenora's life thereafter was a study in restraint. She learned to steward wealth, to acquire discreetly, and to run philanthropic channels that would never be named in the press. She did not crave headlines. Instead, she curated small rescue projects, secret scholarships, quiet restorations. Harrow and Company could buy empires, but often Lenora found her greatest satisfactions in saving small things: a dilapidated theater's murals, a community library's heart, a neighborhood's ancient bench. She catalogued worth the way other people counted change. To the world she presented a cool, composed face. Inside, a clock ticked that sometimes made her move in ways that felt more like atonement than generosity. Her interest in the rusted van started because of the magnet and the strange dullness Jonah, Reese, and Mr. Ellis reported. Those were small anomalies that triggered the memory of a man's lesson: never judge by skin. When Lenora learned a widow had been given the vehicle and that the widow refused to sell, she felt something shift. It wasn't just curiosity about a potentially valuable object. It was the sight of someone refusing to commodify memory. That refusal, coupled with the woman's steady kindness, as Mr. Ellis described it, made Lenora place the van in a different register in her mind. This was not merely a chance to purchase an unusual piece. This was a chance to protect a life that seemed quietly noble. More than that, the more Lenora watched, and Jonah's magnet tests, Reese's clipboard entries, the way Amina tended neighborhood needs, the less she felt like an outsider looking in. She felt implicated. There was a nagging sense that, in her upbringing where nothing was wasted and everything had a ledger, the moral calculus was off balance. Her family had long exchanged privacy for power. Lenora wanted to use that power differently. The van had become, in her head, less an object to be appraised and more a question. What if hidden value could transform the person who had treated it like ordinary life? Meanwhile, Mr. Ellis's history reached back a little further than Daniel's kindness. He had once been, many years ago, a man who'd been turned away from the doors of opportunity, someone who'd slept on a church bench until a stranger gave him a coat. Daniel's intervention years ago had rerouted his life. Ellis had not amounted to riches because life had carried him otherwise, but he had lived as if gratitude were an investment. Helping Amina repair the van was his way of paying a debt he'd never be able to fully settle. In private, he told Amina how Daniel had once given him the only help he'd had in the city. "He didn't want anything from me," Ellis whispered. "He just did what was right." Hearing those old threads, the lineage of compassion in Amina's life, the repeated small mercies that had stitched communities together, Lenora felt something open up. She began to see the possibility that her involvement could be more than a transaction. If Amina was someone who refused to sell what mattered for short-term relief, perhaps she deserved a different ledger, one where dignity was not balanced against necessity but where kindness itself was rewarded. And yet Lenora was cautious. She was not a woman who rushed. She arranged a quiet meeting with Mr. Ellis where she revealed, in fragments, who she was and what she did. She did not show her cards. Instead, she asked questions not of the van but of Amina's life: how she'd come to be a widow, what values she kept, how the children slept at night. The answers were small and human and, in Lenora's vocabulary, priceless. Amina's backstory, the mother who lost a partner and stitched a life not from luck but from habit, deepened the lines on Lenora's face in ways that private wealth had not. For the first time in a long time, Lenora felt the temptation to use her family's resources not to acquire but to restore. It would be a heavy lift, ethically and logistically, because Harrow and Company operated under strict rules. But the rules were made by humans, and Lenora remembered what her father had told her in the scrapyard: never judge by skin. That night, as snow whispered against the window panes and Amina checked each child's blanket, Lenora sat at her own desk with a small map of possibilities. She could buy the van and leave. She could orchestrate a quiet transfer of funds. She could remain a spectator. Instead, she decided she would watch a little longer, but with a new posture, not as an appraiser cataloging objects, but as someone considering whether the ledger of human kindness might be opened and amended. What small parts of your past shaped the way you give and receive kindness? If someone with power quietly watched you, what would they learn about who you truly are, and how might that change how they act toward you? The neighborhood shifted subtly when people began to spend evenings outdoors again. Curtains opened a little sooner, laughter carried across hedges, and the van, patched and quieter now, became a small landmark that children used to give directions. In that slow public season, a different kind of closeness formed between Amina and the woman who had been watching from the margins. Lenora did not announce herself as a benefactor. That would have altered everything. Instead, she arrived as a volunteer. The library needed a reader for a children's hour, the market needed someone to organize donations, and a local small grants committee needed notes on worthy neighborhood projects. She showed up with a plain tote bag, no jewelry ostentation, and a manner that suggested she'd come for the work rather than the applause. When she signed up to read at the library, Amina had been there already, dropping Zara off for a Saturday writing club. The two women brushed shoulders in the corridor and exchanged the kind of polite hello that strangers use while carrying private weights. Their first real conversation happened over spilled flour at the market. Lenora had wandered to Amina's stall under the pretense of examining the lemon curd, but really she came because she wanted to see how Amina moved when she was not on display. "Your scones are wonderful," Lenora said simply, tearing a tiny piece and tasting it like an ordinary patron. "Your daughter's bookmarks are very sweet." Zara, who hovered near the table like a small proud sentry, blushed and tucked a curl behind her ear. Amina, ever practical, offered both women boxes of napkins and a smile. She did not press for explanation when Lenora mentioned the library program. Instead, she accepted a flyer and said, "We'll bring the kids." The recognition that someone in a plain jacket had noticed the family's work felt unusual and, for Amina, oddly significant. She responded with thrifted warmth. "Thank you. We'll be there." At the library event, Lenora read with a cadence that made even the librarian lean forward. She read a story about an old watch that kept time for a small town and then sat in the circle where the parents gathered. After the children left to construct paper boats, Lenora lingered with Amina under the fluorescent hum. "Your daughter writes well," she said, as if returning to an earlier thread. "Has she always loved books?" Her tone was free of the assessment that had colored previous conversations with Harrow and Company clients. Amina let her guard down a fraction. For all the tests and strange offers, the woman at her kitchen table, the one who kept the kids fed and clothes mended, still expected life to be practical in its help. "She remembers everything," Amina said. "Sometimes I'm concerned she remembers more than she should." She told Lenora a small story about Zara composing a letter to a friend who had moved away and leaving it under her pillow, as if letters could keep people close. Lenora listened as if each detail were a small treasure rather than evidence to be filed. That evening, Lenora did something she had learned rarely to do. She admitted curiosity without the shield of reserve. "I've been watching," she said quietly. "Not in a way that intrudes, but people like you are rare." Amina flinched at the phrase, "people like you," as if it were kind and offensive at once. "Why?" she asked. Lenora took a long breath. "Because you refuse to sell what's part of your life. You refuse help when it would cost you a memory. And you give, even when it hurts." She tapped her fingers on the library table where the varnish had been rubbed thin by generations of small hands. "That's not business. That's character." Amina's instinct was to downplay, to measure the sentiment and return it in smaller denominations. "We all do what we can," she said. "It's not much." The reflex was the same one she used for everything. She folded praise into ordinary sentences, making it manageable. Yet Lenora's eyes, which sometimes held a cool appraisal, now reflected soft surprise, as if she'd been asked to admire something she'd thought long extinct. Their pockets of time widened. Lenora started coming by the cafe with a reason she would later invent: a book drop, a meeting, an errand. She sat at the corner table and sipped black coffee while watching Amina move through the room with an economy of motion that made work look like prayer. Once, when a regular customer complained loudly about a delayed sandwich, Lenora rose without thinking and offered him a fresh pastry from Amina's counter with the quiet authority of someone who knew how to fix small crises. Amina noticed the added attention, but did not immediately decode it. She accepted Lenora's kindness as she accepted rain, something that fell and watered the garden but required no mortgage on the soul. She found herself telling Lenora more stories of small domestic errors, of the dead battery she'd ignored for weeks, of Daniel's habit of lining jars with labels in crooked script. Lenora reciprocated with stories that were tidy and constrained: a childhood summer by the sea, a first job cataloging antiques, but there was a moment when she let slip the memory of a scrapyard and a father's voice teaching how to listen to the sound of metal. Amina listened, fascinated by a woman whose life seemed at once very different and oddly familiar. Mr. Ellis watched the relationship with an expression that tightened like a drawn bow. His gratitude for Amina's kindness had moved into protectiveness. Now he found himself guarding a territory he barely understood. Once, when Lenora stayed later than usual at the cafe to arrange a small donation of books to the library, Ellis intercepted her outside. "Be careful," he said, the warning as much for Amina as for himself. She's not used to people who can take what she has. Don't complicate her life." Lenora, with a half-smile, folded the warning into her own considerations. "I won't complicate," she promised. Inside, the promise felt real but also dangerous. She understood complicate as a thin line between help and possession. She had watched Harrow and Company take things, tidy them, and make them into assets. She had always told herself she would never be that kind of person. Yet now she felt a tenderness strong enough to blur her rules. Their bond deepened in small domestic ways. Lenora came by one evening with a wrapped parcel, new school shoes for Nico, the kind that separated the boys at the schoolyard without shout or label. She left the parcel at the threshold and walked away before Amina could protest. Later, when Amina asked quietly who had left them, Lenora waved it off, saying she'd bought them at the market. She did not claim the act aloud. Mr. Ellis, however, took the parcel and smiled as if relieved that someone else had finally acted. A turning point arrived on a particularly bitter night when a pipe burst in the house next door and water flooded the alley. The crew called to help. Neighbors scrambled with buckets. Amina was knee-deep almost before she knew she'd left the kitchen. Zara and Nico worked like small machines, scooping and tossing. Lenora, who'd been passing with a tote, stepped in without direction, sleeves rolled like everyone else, hauling sandbags and shoring the doorway with hands that had the rhythm of training. They worked shoulder to shoulder until dawn moderated the dark. Afterward, exhausted and shivering, Amina sat on the curb with her children and Lenora beside her. They shared a thermos of tea, steam fogging above their heads like a fragile truce with the cold. "Thank you," Amina said in the way people say thanks that is also an admission of belonging. Lenora only responded with a soft, almost embarrassed smile. "You're stronger than you look," she said. "And that's not an insult." In those small exchanges, the two women built a scaffolding of trust that creaked but held. Lenora was still careful. She kept certain cards close to her chest, the notes from Harrow and Company, the magnet test results, the whispered conversations with Jonah, but the part of her that had once catalogued value began to reframe what she wanted to do. She imagined a life where protection did not mean possession. She began to think the van might be preserved, not seized, that a life might be lifted by resources used as a bridge rather than as a purchase. Amina, for her part, was slower to interpret motives. She categorized Lenora as a kind woman with strange precision. She had learned that most kindnesses were transactional in a neighborhood that paid in gestures. But she felt less alone. She slept better. The children found in Lenora a gentle presence who read to them without flattery, and gave them a space to show off their small skills without embarrassment. Little by little, the woman who had once been a steady outsider moved from periphery to presence, and the neighborhood, always hungry for stories, began to murmur acceptance rather than suspicion. When someone crosses the line from stranger to friend, what makes you trust them? Do you prefer people who give quietly, loudly, or not at all? And how does your history shape the way you let someone in? The sun that week seemed to rise in a hurry and then glare, as if the whole town had been asked to be honest about hard things. Amina woke with a weight pressing against her chest the way a hand presses a breathing animal, careful but relentless. The cafe's audit had not gone well. Mrs. Patel, quiet and pragmatic, had to tell staff that morning that business had slowed and shifts would be cut. Amina's schedule lost hours she'd already counted on. A small arithmetic on the back of an envelope suddenly became nothing but empty margins. She tightened the strap on her bag and kept her voice calm when she told the children. "We'll manage," she said, because she had to make the sound of possibility for them even when it felt thin inside. The landlord's letter arrived the same day, folded into the mailbox like a blade with its edge softened. Final notice, the heading said in stark, clinical type. Apparently a payment had failed to process months earlier, a hiccup tucked behind funeral paperwork, and now it wanted a sum that resembled a small apology. Rent, late fees, administrative penalties. The numbers added up into something real and dangerous. Amina sat on the stairs and read the paper until the print blurred, and then she read it again to make sure she hadn't misread the way the world could turn so quickly. By afternoon, the neighborhood had the kind of hush that precedes weather. The in-laws, Ada and Samuel, had been quieter than usual, but their eyes when they crossed paths with Amina were like slotted coins. Small, precise, judgmental. Ada passed by with a grocery bag and said, "You should sell the van. It's what people like you do. You take whatever you can, then complain about the result." Her voice was practiced cruelty in a different register. She said it with a sympathetic lilt as if instructing about household maintenance. Amina closed the door and let the words land. She could have sold the van. It would have cleared the ledger that now stood between them and the landlord's final notice. She could have accepted Jonah's discreet call offering a quick purchase or even taken a loan against its value, but each option felt like a fissure in a house built by memory. The van had been a shelter once, a place where Daniel had kept blankets for ruined birthdays and a jar labeled spare change that Daniel had forgotten to change. It carried their story. She pictured Nico's jaw set when they refused, Zara's small hand on her sleeve, Aim's sleepy insistence that Mr. Moon needs our car to look at clouds. The van was not simply metal to be exchanged for numbers. Instead, she made a list. Sell the extra plates. Cancel the PTA donation jar. Borrow from a cousin with an agreement to pay back in tiny increments. Call the mechanic and plead for a payment plan for the sink and the van registration. It was the house of small compromises. She walked to the post office and handed over the final notice with trembling fingers, and then went to Mrs. Patel and asked if there were extra pastries she could take to sell at the market, any extra shifts she could pick up. She asked for time like someone asking for permission to breathe. Mrs. Patel agreed to try, but her face told a story of businesses that learned to think of kindness as a line item. The crisis deepened that night when Nico woke with a fever. Amina hovered over his bed, palms warming his forehead as if a human hand could chase away the sharpness of heat. The clinic's hours were closing. The prescription was a small thing, an antibiotic and a syrup that cost more than she had on her person. She paced the kitchen and then the living room, trying to arrange numbers, trying to conjure coins from nowhere. In the end, she wrapped Nico, drove the van slowly through streets that smelled like rain even without clouds, and found the clinic's emergency buzzer. The cough of the engine and the smell of old leather were a lullaby and an accusation at once. They were not alone in crisis that week. On the lane behind their house, old Mr. Carter, who lived alone, fell and could not get up. The young paramedic who arrived said it would have taken longer if not for a vehicle that could carry Mr. Carter to the doctor without waiting for ambulance backup. Amina was there before she thought she could be. She drove the van, hands steady even when her heart trembled, because someone needed a lift. She could have argued that every mile cost money she did not have. Instead, she drove because people sometimes need what you have even when you are empty. The day the bailiffs finally came, Amina felt every step she took as if it were measured in inches of courage. They arrived with paper clips of authority and a polite tone. "We're here to execute a writ," said the foreman, and the words were soft but final. Men with clipboards inspected the house and then the van. The van's title, registration, any document that tied ownership, all became the currency of a system that could not see why memory mattered. The in-laws watched from their stoop with a brittle sort of interest that felt like spectatorship. Mrs. Patel called with a sorrowful voice. There would be cash they could advance from next week's takings, but nothing immediate. A distant relative offered a loan that required selling something of value as collateral. Ada suggested they put the children into the care of her sister for a while and move out until things sorted themselves, a thinly veiled demand to be less visible and less troublesome. Amina's choices narrowed to a door that seemed like loss or a window that felt like humiliation. She could sign the van's title and hand it over in exchange for a sum that might last a season. She could let the bailiffs tow the vehicle, a public erasure of a private life. Or she could stand still and hold the memory like a fist. When the bailiffs asked for the keys, Amina stood and placed both hands on the dashboard where Daniel's initials were still scrawled in faded marker. Her fingers traced them as if the letters were a map. "I can give you the title," she said quietly, voice steady with the kind of resolve that doesn't dress itself up. "But please, let me take the kids to school in the morning. Let me keep enough time to manage." The foreman consulted his clipboard with the polite bureaucracy of someone who has been taught to follow rules more than lives. He conferred with the landlord. There was a small concession. They would delay the tow for 48 hours, a sliver of time like sunlight through a door. 48 hours. It was both a mercy and an edge. Amina used that time to spend what little she had to get Nico his medicine, to fix the leak enough to sleep, to gather the children's quilts and her own notebooks to keep safe. She refused offers to go live with Ada and Samuel. Their house was not refuge so much as stage for pity. Instead, she spent an afternoon at the community center, selling the last of the scones, asking neighbors to buy bookmarks they didn't need. She did not sell her pride. She sold tokens that could be replaced. Lenora watched these days from the place where wealthy people keep discretion folded like a handkerchief, quiet, practical, deliberate. Mr. Ellis kept her informed with the kind of updates that were not dramatic, but full of fidelity. "She won't sell," he told Lenora on the phone. "She refuses to let go. She's giving things away, but not that. Not the van. She's standing there and doing what she must." His voice had the reverence of someone watching a saint perform ordinary acts. That evening, when Amina returned home with her hands smelling of lemon curd and condensed milk, she found a plain envelope on the mat. Inside was a note, 2 days. We will meet. L. No money. No explanation. Just the small line that felt like a rope tossed across a river. Lenora had moved from observing to contacting without revealing her full hand. The note was careful, like someone checking the temperature of a delicate stew before deciding whether to stir. Amina sat at the counter with the envelope and felt exhaustion and relief exchange places in her chest. She had clung to the van because it was memory and shelter. She had refused to commodify a life. She had also, in the act of refusing, exposed herself to deeper danger. Now someone with power had offered a sliver of time and a meeting, the posture of someone who might act. Mr. Ellis left the lane that night with a walk that felt like both surrender and hope. He had started this thread out of gratitude. Now he found himself asking whether the debt he felt could be repaid in more than a tool and a thankful word. He carried the image of Amina's hands on the dashboard with him like a prayer. Lenora, at her desk, closed a ledger and opened another. The numbers there were not about profit. They were about rescue. When your hardest hour arrives, what would you refuse to part with? Memory, dignity, or something you love? If someone quietly offered help, how would you decide whether to accept it or to stand on your own 2 feet? The meeting was arranged in a room that smelled faintly of lemon and old paper, the sort of place where people with means often sat to make small decisions that felt huge to everyone else. Lenora had chosen it, neutral, quiet, with a view of the street where, 2 days earlier, a woman had wrestled with the logic of survival and memory. Amina arrived with Zara at her side and Nico clutching a comic to quiet nerves. AIM hovered like a small flag of hope, palms sticky from jam. Mr. Ellis waited on the far side of the table with hands folded like a man who'd come to witness something he could barely name. Lenora stood when they entered and did something she had rarely done in public. She offered her full name without reservation. "Amina," she said, "my name is Lenora Harrow. I owe you an explanation." The way she said it transformed the room. It was a simple sentence that carried the weight of an admission. Amina sat as if she could anchor herself to the chair. Her mouth opened once and then closed. "You're the woman who reads at the library," she said, the observation a small island in a flood of questions. Lenora smiled, an expression less cool than Amina had imagined. "I am that woman," she answered. "I am also the person behind Harrow and Company, acquisitions, collections, a family business that's existed for a long time." The name landed like a coin on the table. Amina had heard of Harrow and Company in passing, a place older mothers muttered about when they wanted to say, "They buy things people think are lost." It was a private world, not hostile but impenetrable. Lenora did not parade that opacity. Instead she leaned forward and for once allowed a different register to govern her voice: plainness. "You've been careful," Lenora said. "You've refused offers, you've protected what matters to you, and you've given when you had less than most. You have done these things not for cameras or gratitude, but because it's what you believe is right. Mr. Ellis told me this." She tipped her chin toward the older man. He nodded like someone absolved of a small debt. Amina felt the color rise to her face. "You don't owe me anything," she said before she could stop herself. The reflex to decline help sounded like the old reflex to stitch a torn dress rather than buy a new one. Lenora's fingers touched a small file on the table and she produced photographs, close-ups of panels, grainy images taken by the technician Reese, and the magnet test logged in Jonah's note. She placed them down slowly so each picture could speak. "We did some tests," she said. "We had professionals examine the van's bodywork, the undercarriage, and we noticed anomalies. The metal is non-ferrous in places, and certain panels had a density that didn't match their outward appearance. It was irregular." She watched the way that factual phrasing made the air change in the room. Amina waited, heart thudding, for the part that would feel like business jargon spun into a trap. Instead, Lenora took a breath that pulled from a private folder of empathy. "There's something else," she continued. "Daniel, your late husband, was not a man who waved to the world for attention. He helped people. We discovered through research and some unconventional digging evidence that he once came into possession of rare material. It appears parts of the van's structure include precious metal, gold." For a breath, the room paused as if the air itself had become denser. Zara's hand went to her mouth. Nico's eyes enlarged and then darted to the van as though it were suddenly a treasure chest. Even Mr. Ellis, who had watched the story from the margins, made a small involuntary sound like a release of air. "Gold." Amina repeated, the word both absurd and incandescent. In her mind she saw Daniel's hands, always oil-stained patient, and wondered how such a man could have stumbled into something so improbable. "How could that be?" she asked. The question was not greed. It was surprise to the point of disbelief. Lenora accepted the disbelief like a currency she had meant to exchange. "There are several plausible explanations," she said. "Sometimes old parade floats were gilded and then discarded. Sometimes old estates sold bits and pieces. Sometimes people melt down circuit boards and salvage tiny amounts of gold from electronics. Unlikely, but not impossible given his skill set. We don't know exactly how Daniel acquired it, only that years of use and concealment could have left precious metals hidden in the van's structure." She tapped a photograph of the undercarriage where the magnet had refused to adhere. "The results say the van has density anomalies consistent with a higher value metal beneath surface layers." Amina sat very still. The idea felt like a dream, one of those dreams that shimmers just at the edge of a window, offering a view but no door. "But why are you telling me?" she asked, suspicion and hope braided together. Lenora's hands folded. "Because I had two choices," she said. "I could have bought the van outright and catalogued it as an object. Harrow and Company has done that before. We take things, preserve them, resell or donate pieces to institutions. But I watched you. I watched the way you refused to sell your memory for a sum of money. I listened to the way you treated neighbors and the way you taught your children to repair things rather than discard them. That changed my understanding of what this van was. It was not simply an object, it was a life." She let the sentence hang like an offering. So I came to a different conclusion. If the van holds something that could change your family's future, it should not be taken from you. It should be used to restore what life took. But we are Harrow and Company, and even we must work within certain rules. I want to be direct. We can extract the value discreetly and in a way that preserves the van's memory for you, or we can partner with you to ensure that the proceeds benefit not only your family but also your neighborhood. We can set up a fund, a small business grant, cover your arrears, secure schooling for the children, and here Lenora paused, as if the words were heavy and required care. We can do it without taking the story away from Daniel or you. Amina's breath hitched. That the world could present such a careful form of help felt both unfamiliar and frightening. Why? She asked again, softer. Why would you do that for us? Lenora's eyes softened in a way that made her seem, for a rare second, like the woman who had stood in scrap yards as a girl with a magnet and an eager heart. Because my father taught me to listen to metal, she said. And because sometimes we have resources that make the difference between a life that keeps being small and a life that has space to breathe. Because Mr. Ellis told me the story of your husband's kindness when he was a young man. It stayed with me. You gave what you had. It is time someone returned that. There was a silence pregnant with complex possibilities. Amina looked to Mr. Ellis, who met her gaze and nodded with a loyalty that felt like benediction. She thought of Ada's taunts, of landlord's letters, of Nico's fevered face that had not yet left her memory. She thought of Daniel's initials on the dashboard and how they seemed to pulse like a small heart in that moment. Lenora handed across a paper with a line itemized in plain language: extraction, preservation, legal transfer of proceeds to a trust, immediate payment to cover rent and clinic bills, funds assigned for school, and a small amount to refurbish the van in a way that honored its memory. We will not strip what makes it special, she promised. We will not take your story. We will restore your life. Amina felt a tremor somewhere deep inside that was equal parts fear and relief. The offer promised a doorway out of endless compromises. But behind the door, she worried about the shape of gratitude if it became duty. If I accept, she said slowly, it will change things. Her voice was thin with the knowledge that life-altering help often redraws lines and asks bodies to adapt. Lenora nodded. Yes, she said. And I won't pretend it won't. But you won't lose the van. You will keep it. We will honor whatever you want preserved, Daniel's initials, the jar, the dents that speak of Sunday trips. You will also have access to funds, training, and a small business plan if you want it, to make the van more than memory, a way to earn, to travel, to be secure. And there is one more thing. Lenora paused and looked at Amina with a steadiness that felt like commitment. I will remain involved only as long as you ask me to, and no longer. This is not a takeover. It is a gift, but only if you ask for help. The room held its breath. Amina's life had been a series of refusals and tiny salvations. The invitation now on the table was a map drawn in ink she had not expected. She thought of her mother's lesson, kindness as a muscle, and of Daniel's patient hands. She thought of Mr. Ellis sleeping in the street once, of Jonah tapping at the undercarriage, of the magnet that refused to cling. Finally, with hands that trembled but were steady in their conviction, Amina reached out and took Lenora's hand. I need time, she said, voice small as the space between coins. I'm not good at promises about forever. But I want us to do this in a way that keeps Daniel in the picture. I don't want to owe anyone my story. Lenora's reply was immediate and soft. Then we will do it your way, she said. We will build the plan together. We'll preserve the van. We'll honor Daniel. We'll help you stand. Outside, a late winter sun slid between buildings and gilded the corner of the window. The decision had been made. The plan existed now in the world as words and promises. Tension did not evaporate. It folded into the waiting. What remained was the life-changing work that would require trust, legal papers, cautious extraction, and the courage to allow help when one had grown adept at standing alone. If someone offers to change your life overnight, what conditions would you insist on? How do you keep your history intact while accepting help? And who would you want in the room when that decision is made? The work began in the gray hour before dawn, the kind of small, determined labor Amina had known her whole life. Lawyers with careful hands and softer voices sat across the kitchen table and explained, without patronizing, what would be done. Discreet extraction by a specialist metallurgist, preservation of key panels bearing Daniel's initials, immediate funds wired to clear the rent and clinic bills, an education trust for the children, and a small business grant to turn the van into something that would both honor the past and secure the future. Lenora hovered at the edges of meetings like a woman learning to be quiet about wealth. Mr. Ellis sat often with hands folded and an expression that could be read as relief or prayer. Amina read the documents with a measured focus. Paper after paper bore names and clauses and a promise written in the language of law. It felt strange to watch lines of currency unspool into her life without her having to barter for them. She thought of the nights she had stitched holes in winter socks, of the mornings she'd held children while the city warmed up, and she felt the odd weight of gratitude that did not feel like debt. "We will preserve Daniel's initials and certain interior pieces exactly as they are," Lenora said one morning, voice stern with conviction. "We will not sell them. Those elements will remain yours." Amina ran her palms over the thin scar of marker on a rough photograph until she could feel the memory like a pulse. The metallurgist arrived in a van that smelled of solvent and polish. He moved with a technician's tenderness, as if metal were a living thing that had been asleep too long. He bored into panels where extraction would yield the value and did so with microscopic precision, a practiced harvesting that left the van whole, a kind of surgery. Jonah and Reese watched from the perimeter, looking relieved by the steadiness of the work. The magnet tests that had once puzzled them now read as a puzzle with a design, gold bonded in layers with other alloys long ago melted into patchwork, the kind of accidental hoard that happens when people reuse, repurpose, and save. When the first transfer hit Amina's account, an amount that seemed, at first, like a mistake on the bank's side, she sat with her forehead on the kitchen table and let the absurdity settle. The landlord called with a stilted apology and a promise to lift the notice immediately. The clinic refunded the emergency surcharge. The children's school administrator sent a polite email confirming the trust's acceptance and the fee schedule set for Zara and Nico. For the first time in years, the arithmetic of their lives rearranged itself into a pattern with breathing room. But the transformation did not begin with money. It began with a design. Lenora insisted that Amina keep the van. "You told me what it meant," she said gently. "You won't lose what's important." The plan they co-designed was practical and stubborn. The van would become a mobile community hub, part repair shop, part coffee stand, part micro-library. It was, in its own way, exactly Daniel's kind of thing. Repair, sustenance, and stories wrapped up in one vehicle. "Daniel fixed things and fed people," Mr. Ellis said at the planning meeting, his voice catching. "This will be an echo of that." There were workshops to organize. Lenora put out a modest fund for an 8-week training program so Amina could learn the basics of small business bookkeeping, customer relations, and light maintenance beyond the skills she'd already begun to master. Jonah offered the scrapyard as a space for early practice, letting her and the neighborhood kids come on slow days to learn how to patch a fender or wire a light. Zara began to write sales slips with a neatness that made the neighbors smile. Nico, whose fever had left him quieter but stubborn, learned to steam milk for lattes, delighting in the hiss as if it were a new kind of music. Aim took charge of story hours, his small voice commanding an audience of toddlers by the second week. Opening day arrived with a sky washed in a forgiving blue. They painted a small sign in simple letters, Daniel's Van, Repair, Coffee, Stories. Amina insisted that Daniel's initials remain on the dashboard, beneath a glass dome installed by the metallurgist, visible, untampered, sacred. They hung Zara's bookmarks from a string like little flags and placed a jar for tips that bore the old label Daniel had used for spare change. Lenora stood at a distance that was both proud and respectful, wearing an ordinary coat and shoes that had spent their life on many floors, not just carpets. Mr. Ellis arrived early with a thermos and a sandwich wrapped in brown paper. Jonah busied himself with cords and nuts, his hands competent and pleased. People came in a ripple, neighbors, Mrs. Patel with a plate of cinnamon buns, the librarian with a stack of donated books, old Mr. Carter who now walked with a cane and a grateful grin. The in-laws arrived too, their presence a study in contradicting faces, curiosity, regret, a practiced smile that couldn't quite hide shock when they learned what had been done. Ada's lips thinned when she saw the sign. Samuel clapped too loudly and then fell silent as if the room's attention embarrassed him. They approached Amina with a kind of clumsy praise that smelled faintly of apology. "Well done," Ada said, voice brittle. "Good for you." Amina answered as she always had, with a measured kindness that did not pretend yesterday's insults had evaporated. "Thank you," she said. "There's coffee. Sit." The business quickly became more than a source of income. It became a place where neighbors swapped stories and recipes, where teenagers learned to change oil and older men taught shorthand tricks to curious kids, where mothers met over steaming mugs and teachers found a corner to grade papers. The proceeds from the original extraction funded a scholarship that paid for a technical course for Zara and small emergency funds that neighbors could apply to discreetly. Lenora introduced a matching program where community projects could apply for microgrants, the work of Harrow and Company quietly redirected to neighborhood needs. Amina remained, in the heart of it, unwaveringly herself. She took tips and left change when someone had forgotten. She refused offers that would have turned the van into an upscale experience, and she insisted that repairs be affordable. Her hands were still calloused. Her smile was still the sort of small, disciplined thing that had been earned. When journalists, the polite kind the library called, came asking about the story, she answered simply, "We keep what matters. We work." She did not let the recognition make her larger than she was. The money changed the shape of their days, not the center of their hearts. There were complications, of course. Legal forms required signatures and oversight. Lenora stayed involved in the first year to ensure transparency and to teach Amina when documents felt like traps. Ada tried to assert a claim on sentimental grounds, saying she had a closer tie to Daniel since he was her brother. The lawyers smiled and showed her the will, the recorded transfer, the words Daniel had written, clear and unambiguous. Ada left with her dignity and tact, but none the richer. Amina treated the episode as a closed door. She did not gloat. She simply closed the ledger and focused on tomorrow's menu. Months later, when the mobile van pulled up at a school fair and children streamed in for free hot chocolate and a quick fix for a squeaky bike wheel, Amina felt the same steady pulse she'd felt in the first years after Daniel's death. The sense that goodness, when offered, returns not a spectacle but a small, durable joy. Lenora greeted her at the gate and, without fanfare, placed a hand on Amina's arm. "You did the work," she said. "You kept the soul of it." Amina smiled, wetness prickling at the corner of her eyes. "We did," she corrected. "We all did." At night, after the lights were turned off and the mugs washed, Amina sat in the driver's seat and traced Daniel's initials with a fingertip. The glass dome reflected a small constellation of kitchen light. Nico snored softly in the back in a pile of blankets. Zara had left a notebook open where a new story began with a van and a girl who fixed more than engines. Aim dreamt of clouds. Amina thought of all the people whose small kindnesses had threaded through their lives. Mr. Ellis giving up his time, Jonah tapping the undercarriage, Lenora deciding not to take, the neighbor who shared soup. Her heart held gratitude the way it once held worry. The transformation had not made her a different person. She still feared late bills and still fussed over small household things. But the arc of fear had been softened. Choices were now options, not terrors. The world that had once mocked her for a rusted van now came to the van for help and warmth. People learned slowly that value often hides under the most ordinary surfaces. On the last page of Zara's notebook that year, she wrote a sentence that Amina found and framed on the kitchen shelf. Sometimes what looks like rust is only the beginning of gold. Amina kept the sentence there like a small light. If someone unexpectedly handed you a doorway out of a hard season, what would you want preserved from your past? And what would you want to build for the future? How do you hold on to humility when life finally tilts in your favor? Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. If this touched your heart, then you're going to love the next one. It's just as powerful, and even more intriguing than you can imagine. So don't stop here. Check out more videos on my channel and continue the journey. I'll be waiting for you on the other side of that story. See you there.